America just lost its most important trading ally in Asia, and if you're watching mainstream news, you probably missed it completely. I'm not talking about China pulling some country into their orbit. I'm talking about Japan, America's most reliable partner since 1945, the country that hosts 54,000 US troops, the nation we rebuilt in our own image, quietly shifting its economic center of gravity toward Beijing. In 2023, for the first time in modern history, Japan's trade dependence on China exceeded its trade relationship with the United States by a margin so significant it represents a structural realignment, not a temporary fluctuation. And here's what nobody tells you: this isn't about ideology, security agreements, or even politics. It's about cold economic mathematics that no amount of diplomatic pressure can reverse. I'm going to walk you through the three economic forces that pulled Japan, the world's third largest economy, America's most strategically vital Asian ally, into deeper integration with the very country we're asking them to help us contain. And once you understand these three systems, you'll realize this pattern is already repeating across Southeast Asia, Europe, and even Latin America. My opinion? We're watching the consequences of a strategic miscalculation that Washington still refuses to acknowledge. You cannot ask countries to decouple from their largest economic partner while offering no comparable alternative. Let me break this down using what I call the three pillars of economic gravity, because conventional analysis focuses on what countries say in diplomatic statements while ignoring what their actual trade flows reveal. Here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. Western analysts point to the US-Japan Security Alliance, shared democratic values, and bilateral agreements as proof of unshakable partnership. But those same analysts ignore the numbers that actually drive national economic policy. In 2023, Japan's total trade with China reached $317 billion. Their trade with the United States, $263 billion. That's a $54 billion gap, and it's been widening every year since 2019. Let me show you the numbers that matter. The first pillar is what I call supply chain integration depth, and it goes far beyond simple import-export totals. Japan imported $184 billion worth of goods from China in 2023. Not luxury items or consumer electronics they could source elsewhere. We're talking about intermediate industrial goods, rare earth elements, chemical products, and electronic components that Japanese manufacturers literally cannot obtain in comparable quantity, quality, or price from any other single source. Here's the specific breakdown that reveals the dependency. 87% of Japan's rare earth imports come from China. These aren't optional materials, they're essential for manufacturing everything from hybrid car motors to precision electronics. Japan imports 43% of its textiles and apparel from China, 38% of its electrical machinery components, and 31% of its general machinery parts. But here's what makes this genuinely irreversible in the short term. These aren't finished consumer goods that Japan could simply buy from Vietnam or Indonesia instead. These are highly specialized industrial inputs embedded deep in Japanese manufacturing supply chains that took 2 decades to optimize. When I spoke with a supply chain manager at a major Japanese automotive parts manufacturer in Nagoya last year, he put it bluntly: we've been told to diversify away from Chinese suppliers for 3 years now. We've identified alternative sources for maybe 15% of our inputs. The rest, there's no one else who can deliver the volume, specifications, and price point. We'd have to redesign our entire production process. That's not a political choice. That's physical and economic reality. But here's the part that should terrify American strategists. This dependency runs both directions, which actually makes it more stable, not less. Japan exported $133 billion to China in 2023: machinery, automobiles, precision instruments, and high-end industrial equipment that Chinese manufacturers need for their own production. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute, because the second pillar isn't about what Japan trades with China, it's about what China offers that America structurally cannot match. Stay with me, because what comes next explains why diplomatic pressure and security guarantees are losing to economic incentives. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. I call it market access asymmetry, and it's the reason why Japan, despite all its security concerns about China, keeps deepening economic ties. Most people think trade relationships are symmetrical. Two countries exchange goods of roughly equal value and importance, but here's what's really happening between Japan and China. China offers Japan something America simply cannot provide: access to the world's largest consumer market at the exact moment when Japan's domestic market is shrinking. Let me show you what this actually means in numbers. Japan's population peaked at 128 million in 2008 and has been declining ever since. As of 2024, it's 125 million and falling by approximately 500,000 people annually. By 2050, Japan's population is projected to drop to 105 million. That's 20 million fewer consumers, roughly the equivalent of losing the entire population of New York State, Florida, and Illinois combined. Meanwhile, China's middle class, defined as households earning $10,000 to $60,000 annually, reached 707 million people in 2023. That's not total population, that's middle-class consumers with disposable income. To put that in perspective, that's 5.6 times Japan's entire population, and it's still growing. Here's my prediction. By 2030, Japanese companies will be more dependent on Chinese consumer demand than Chinese companies are on Japanese industrial exports. That's when the power dynamic fundamentally shifts. For Japanese automakers, this is existential. Toyota sold 1.9 million vehicles in China in 2023, compared to 2.3 million in the United States and just 1.6 million in Japan itself. Honda sold 1.2 million vehicles in China versus 1.4 million in the US. But here's the critical trend. China sales are growing while US and domestic Japan sales are stagnating or declining. Now apply this same pattern across consumer electronics, cosmetics, luxury goods, and food products. Shiseido, Japan's largest cosmetics company, generates 26% of its total revenue from China, more than from Japan itself. Fast Retailing, which owns Uniqlo, derives 31% of revenue from Greater China. Panasonic, Sony, and Canon all have double-digit revenue exposure to the Chinese market. Here's what nobody tells you about this dependency. It's not just about current sales, it's about future growth. When a Japanese company's board looks at demographic projections, they see domestic market contraction for the next 30 years. When they look at China, they see growth potential that doesn't exist anywhere else at comparable scale. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because we need to understand the mechanism that makes this irreversible. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out in corporate decision-making because this illustrates why security concerns lose to economic incentives. In 2022, the Japanese government, under heavy pressure from Washington, announced initiatives to reduce supply chain dependence on China and support friendshoring to Southeast Asian countries. Major Japanese corporations publicly supported these statements, but when I examined actual capital investment data from the Japan External Trade Organization, here's what the numbers showed. Japanese foreign direct investment into China in 2023 was $11.2 billion. Investment into all of Southeast Asia combined, $19.7 billion. That sounds like diversification until you realize that China, as a single country, still received 36% of what went to an entire region of 11 countries. And more revealing, the China investments were heavily concentrated in advanced manufacturing, R&D centers, and consumer-facing operations, long-term strategic commitments, not short-term hedges. Here's what I genuinely doubt. I don't think Japanese corporate leaders believe American assurances that decoupling from China is economically viable. They're making the minimum symbolic gestures to satisfy political pressure while continuing to deepen the relationships that actually drive their revenue growth. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute, because the third pillar isn't about trade or markets. It's about technology and infrastructure investments that create dependencies so deep they can't be unwound without destroying entire industries. And once you see the specific projects that lock in this relationship, the third pillar is what I call technological interdependence infrastructure. And this is where economic integration becomes so deep that decoupling stops being a policy option and becomes economic self-destruction. Here's what the mainstream gets wrong when they talk about US-Japan alliance versus China-Japan trade. They treat these as separate domains, security over here, economics over there, as if countries can neatly compartmentalize. But here's what's really happening. Japanese and Chinese companies are co-developing technologies, building joint research facilities, and creating intellectual property that neither side fully owns independently. Let me show you the numbers that matter. As of 2023, there were 847 active joint ventures between Japanese and Chinese companies, not simple licensing agreements. but actual co-owned entities developing everything from battery technology to semiconductor manufacturing equipment to pharmaceutical compounds. That's up from 1,340 in 2018, a 38% increase during the exact period when Washington was pressuring Tokyo to reduce China exposure. But here's the specific mechanism that makes this irreversible. These aren't just commercial partnerships. They're integrated research and development ecosystems where separating would mean both sides losing years of progress and billions in sunk costs. Take the battery industry as a concrete example because this illustrates the entire dynamic perfectly. Panasonic, one of Japan's most strategically important tech companies, has a joint venture with Chinese battery manufacturer Envision ASC. They're co-developing next-generation lithium-ion and solid-state battery technology. The R&D facility is in China. The intellectual property is jointly owned. The production lines are integrated across both countries' facilities. Now, if Japan were to decouple from this arrangement under political pressure, what actually happens? Panasonic loses access to technology it co-created, loses the Chinese production capacity it depends on for scale, and hands complete control of next-generation battery tech to Chinese competitors. Meanwhile, Japanese automakers who depend on those batteries for electric vehicles lose their supply source. That's not a trade-off, that's unilateral disarmament in the technology sector. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people deeply uncomfortable. America is asking Japan to sacrifice real economic interests for hypothetical security benefits. And increasingly, Japanese policymakers are smiling, nodding, and then doing what their economic survival requires. My opinion on what this really means: the US-Japan alliance will remain strong on paper and in military cooperation, but economic policy is diverging so fundamentally that we're creating a new category: security allies who are economic partners with our strategic competitor. Let me give you the specific numbers that reveal how far this has gone. In 2023, Japanese companies filed 12,861 patent applications in China, the second highest of any foreign country after the United States. But here's what's more revealing: 38% of those patents were filed jointly with Chinese co-applicants. That's not selling technology to China, that's creating technology with China. The semiconductor equipment sector shows this even more starkly. Tokyo Electron, Japan's largest semiconductor equipment manufacturer, derives 27% of its revenue from China. Advantest, which makes chip testing equipment, gets 31% of revenue from Chinese customers. Screen Holdings, another critical semiconductor equipment maker, is at 24% China exposure. Now, here's why this matters for American chip strategy. The US CHIPS Act is trying to build domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity while simultaneously restricting China's access to advanced chip making equipment. But Japanese companies make much of that equipment, and they're economically dependent on Chinese demand. The contradiction is obvious. America wants Japanese companies to restrict sales to their largest customers while offering no compensation for the lost revenue. How do you think that math works out? When I spoke with a former Japanese Ministry of Economy official in Tokyo 6 months ago, he explained the bind perfectly. We understand American security concerns. We share many of them. But Washington is asking us to accept certain economic pain while offering uncertain security benefits. Meanwhile, Beijing is offering certain economic benefits in exchange for continued engagement. Which would you choose? Here's what I genuinely question. Does Washington understand that alliance management in the 21st century requires economic alternatives, not just military guarantees? Because the current approach is producing exactly the opposite of its intended effect. Let me pull this together and show you why this isn't just about Japan. It's a preview of what's happening globally. So let me pull this together because what's happening with Japan isn't an isolated case. It's the template for how economic gravity is reshaping alliances across the entire global system. Regardless of what politicians say in press conferences, we covered the 3 pillars of economic gravity: supply chain integration depth, market access asymmetry, and technological interdependence infrastructure. Individually, each pillar creates friction against decoupling. Together, they create what I call the alliance commerce divergence, the moment when security partnerships and economic partnerships point in opposite directions, and countries are forced to choose which one actually governs their behavior. Here's what matters: Japan isn't abandoning the US alliance. They're keeping the security umbrella while quietly ignoring the economic demands that come with it. And this pattern is repeating everywhere. South Korea's trade with China is 2.4 times larger than with the US. Germany's China trade exceeds US trade. Australia exports 5 times more to China than to America. Vietnam has territorial disputes with China, but makes China its largest trading partner anyway. This is the part that should surprise you. The countries most integrated with American security architecture are simultaneously the ones deepening economic ties with China fastest. It's not a contradiction, it's a rational hedging strategy. Take American military protection, take Chinese economic opportunity, manage the tension, hope it doesn't break. When I was in Seoul last year, a South Korean Trade Ministry official told me something remarkably candid over dinner. We know what Washington wants, we know what Beijing offers. We also know our economy grows 2.8% with China trade and would shrink without it. So we smile at both and do what we must to survive. That's not betrayal. That's pragmatism in a world where security and economics are decoupling. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because what comes next determines whether the American alliance system survives in its current form. Let me give you 3 scenarios based on current trajectories. Scenario 1, managed divergence. The United States accepts that economic and security partnerships can exist on separate tracks. Japan, South Korea, and European allies maintain military cooperation with Washington while deepening trade with Beijing. America stops demanding economic decoupling and focuses purely on military containment and technology restrictions in narrow, truly strategic sectors like advanced semiconductors and AI. This requires Washington to accept a more limited definition of national security and stop treating every economic interaction as a zero-sum competition. Scenario 2, forced choice. America escalates pressure on allies to choose between security and commerce. Secondary sanctions, investment restrictions, technology export controls expand until countries face genuine binary decisions. Some allies comply, fracturing their economies. Others quietly drift toward neutrality or even Chinese alignment. The alliance system fragments. American global influence contracts to a smaller, more ideologically cohesive but economically weaker bloc. This is the scenario where America wins the principle but loses the system. Scenario 3, economic counteroffer. The United States fundamentally restructures its approach, offering genuine economic alternatives to Chinese market access, massive infrastructure investment in allied economies, preferential trade agreements that actually increase market access, technology transfer and industrial policy that makes allied companies competitive without Chinese supply chains. This would require congressional funding at levels not seen since the Marshall Plan and a complete rethinking of free market orthodoxy. Here's my prediction, and I'll state it plainly. Scenario 1 is what happens by default. Messy, contradictory, unstable managed divergence where everyone pretends the contradictions don't exist until a crisis forces clarity. It's not optimal, but it's the path of least resistance for all parties. Here's my doubt. I'm not convinced American policymakers have accepted that we no longer have the economic leverage to enforce compliance from allies whose prosperity depends on access to markets. We don't control. The world changed, the toolkit didn't. So what should you take away? Not despair, but recognition. Japan didn't choose China over America. They chose economic survival over ideological alignment. And they did it while maintaining security cooperation with Washington because, rationally, they want both. The uncomfortable truth is this: alliances built on shared threats can coexist with economic partnerships with that same threat as long as the economics don't force a military crisis. But the more America demands allies sacrifice commerce for security, the more we discover that for most countries, prosperity is a more immediate concern than hypothetical future conflicts. Subscribe if you want more analysis on how economic realities are reshaping geopolitical alliances in ways that make traditional security frameworks obsolete. And comment your question: can the US alliance system survive when allies are economically integrated with America's strategic competitor, or is this arrangement fundamentally unstable? The numbers are clear. Japan's economic future is increasingly tied to China. Their security depends on America, and somehow they're trying to maintain both relationships simultaneously. Whether that's sustainable or a recipe for crisis depends on whether Washington accepts the new rules or keeps playing by the old ones until the system breaks.